Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really glad because I know that you're tuning in from different parts of the world. So thank you for being here. And welcome back to those who joined us in previous webinars. It's good to have you with us for this special session. And also a warm welcome, of course, to those joining us for the first time. My name is Federica Paolucci, and I'll be your host today for this webinar. I'm joined by Dr. Mirjam Hazenbosch, Sustainable Business Program Manager at the Zoological Society of London. She'll be soon sharing valuable insights on why biodiversity loss is a critical issue for businesses, especially in the fashion and design industries. Before we start, I would like to extend a big and special thank you to Aquafil for spearheading this initiative. This webinar is part of a bigger initiative called the econylacademy, which is a resource platform to talk about ideas, new best practices, industry benchmarks, and many other interesting and relevant topics as a way to always push the boundaries to do things better, both for the planet and its people. And this particular webinar is presented in partnership with Diesel Consulting, which is a management advisory firm specializing in strategy, storytelling, and skills. So before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom right of the screen here, where you can see a little chat box. Feel free to write here if you'd like to participate in the discussion, or if you have any questions or comments during the session. We'll also have a brief Q&A section at the end, but also during the section, if you have any questions, as I said, please feel free to write them in the box. Also, if you have any technical difficulties connecting to or hearing the speaker, do let us know and someone will be ready to assist you. Lastly, for disclosure, I'd like to highlight that the webinar is recorded. So if you can't stay during the entire session, no worries at all. We'll send you over the recording for your viewing. Well, now allow me finally to introduce you Dr. Mirjam Hazenbosch, Sustainable Business Program Manager at the Zoological Society of London. She combines academic expertise and corporate consultancy to help companies reduce their environmental impact and embrace nature-positive strategies. So the initial round of presentations has come to an end. So now I'll leave the floor to Mirjam. Mirjam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Federica, for the very kind introduction. Awesome. Okay, well, yeah, thanks again, Federica. And also a big thank you to everyone who has tuned in today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy work schedules to attend the call today. What I'll do in the next 30 minutes or so is I'll give you an overview as to why biodiversity matters for businesses, especially in the fashion and design industries. I'll kick us off with a quick definition of biodiversity, and then I'll talk about the risks and opportunities when it comes to biodiversity for businesses, especially in the fashion and design industries. And I'll spend a good chunk of time talking about how, as a business, you can get started or continue your biodiversity journey. As Federica said, super happy to take questions during the webinar today. Or at the end during the Q&A session. If you prefer to ask questions offline, that's also completely fine. I'll leave my details at the end of the PowerPoint deck, and feel free to reach out to me afterwards as well. Always super happy to chat, especially when it comes to biodiversity. Before we dive into the topic of biodiversity, let me give you a very quick introduction to ZSL, just so you know the organization that I work for and the perspective that I come from a bit better. So as Federica said, ZSL stands for the Zoological Society of London, and we are a global conservation organization that works towards a world where wildlife thrives. We've been around for 199 years, so next year is our 200th anniversary, which we're very much looking forward to. Most people know ZSL from the two zoos that we run. So we have a zoo in Regent's Park in London, and that's London Zoo, and then we also have Whipsnade Zoo, just an hour north of London. And in our zoos, we host a lot of threatened and extinct in the wild species. And we allow the public to interact with those species and to learn about their conservation. The second part of ZSL that's usually a lot less well known is the Institute of Zoology. That's our scientific arm. And that's where our professors, our postdocs, PhD students, and master students sit. And they research anything related to nature conservation. And a lot of that science feeds into the day-to-day management of the animals that we have in our zoos. The third part of ZSL, and that's the part that I sit in, is the Conservation and Policy Department. And our job is to implement global conservation programs to safeguard threatened species. Within the Conservation and Policy Department, I head up the Sustainable Business team, and I sit in the Sustainable Business and Finance team. So our job is to support organizations, including businesses, but also financial institutions, NGOs, and universities, to encourage them to do more for nature. And we do this through providing lots of different services. So we support organizations to getting started on their biodiversity journey through webinars like we're doing today. We support businesses to comply with incoming regulations and frameworks around nature and biodiversity. We provide a lot of training also in our zoos, so people can then also interact with the animals at the end. We develop nature strategies, and we do a lot of biodiversity monitoring, especially on palm oil companies, plantations, but yeah, all across the world we do a lot of biodiversity monitoring. And all of this work feeds into this vision of working towards a world where wildlife thrives alongside humans. So that's a very quick introduction to ZSL and the work that I do at ZSL. So now back to the topic of today. What is biodiversity and why does it matter for businesses? A lot of people get quite scared by the term biodiversity, but if we break it down, biodiversity can be quite simple. The word biodiversity comes from the Greek word bios, which means life, and the Latin word diversitas, which means variety. So very literally, biodiversity means the variety of life. So any life that you see around you is part of biodiversity. So maybe you have a plant at your desk, maybe you have pets or even the housemates you're living with, the bacteria, the fungi on your skin, they're all part of biodiversity. A lot of people use the words biodiversity and nature interchangeably, and quite often that's not a big issue, but it's good to be aware of the fact that technically they're not the same thing. So biodiversity is life, as I said. Nature is bigger than biodiversity. It includes life, but it also includes the bigger physical environment that is not made by humans. So think of things like rivers, the sea, climate, stones, mountains. So technically you can have nature without biodiversity, although it's unlikely because there will always be a bacteria somewhere, but technically you can have nature without biodiversity. And then obviously you can have nature with biodiversity. A lot of companies, including in the fashion industry, will have worked on nature through their carbon and climate programs. And that's super important because we're in the middle of a climate crisis and we really need to bring those carbon emissions down. But if we think about the sustainability transition more holistically, there are a lot more topics that we should and could be working on. And biodiversity is one of them. And that's the topic that I'll be diving into today, of course. But I just want to appreciate that that's part of a lot of other topics that are all part of this sustainability transition. So things like the water crisis, health, education, inequality, overconsumption, they're all super important and all very much interlinked. But today our focus is biodiversity, of course. So in the next few slides, I'll talk a little bit more about the state of biodiversity on our planet today and why it matters for businesses. And I just have to give you a very quick warning that the next few slides might feel a bit depressing. And I'm sorry about that, but I kind of have to talk you through it because that's the science that's out there. Those are the facts that we just have to face. But I promise you that there will be light at the end of the tunnel, and I'll talk a lot about solutions and what we can do to reverse any biodiversity loss a lot later in the webinar as well. So I just hang on in there, bear with me for those few slides. But again, I promise that there will be more of a conservation optimism story towards the end. So here we go. Biodiversity at the moment is not doing great at all. WWF, in collaboration with ZSL, calculates the Living Planet Index. And this is a measure that shows how species are faring. And the latest figure from 2024 is showing that between 1970 and 2020, we've seen an average rate of decline in population sizes of wildlife of 73%. So that's a huge number. So we've lost a lot of our wildlife on this planet. And we're seeing the steepest declines in freshwater ecosystems. So why is this, you may ask? Well, there are a lot of drivers of biodiversity loss. And on this slide, I'm showing you the 5 direct drivers of biodiversity loss. So the first direct driver of biodiversity loss is habitat loss and modification. Here you can think of tropical rainforest conversion for agriculture, for example. Loads of natural areas are being converted so we can plant crops, including cotton and palm oil and soy, but also for livestock like cattle and sheep and goats, for example. The second direct driver of biodiversity loss is the climate breakdown. A lot of animals can live in quite narrow temperature ranges. And if species have to function outside of these temperature ranges, it becomes quite difficult for them. And especially reproduction might be compromised then. The third direct driver of biodiversity loss is unsustainable exploitation of species. So here you can think of the overharvesting of timber, but also of fish, for example. About 90% of all fish populations worldwide are being impacted by overexploitation. The fourth direct driver is pollution. There's an awful lot of pollution that's happening on land, but also in the seas and in our freshwater ecosystems. It's estimated that about 8 million tons of plastic, for example, comes into the oceans every year. And this has huge impacts on the wildlife. And for the fashion industry, microplastics, for example, are a massive issue that have a lot of impact on wildlife all around the world. And the fifth direct driver of biodiversity loss are invasive alien species, diseases, and pathogens. Obviously, there's a lot of movement happening worldwide, and that also means that unwanted species move around, and they can, again, have massive impacts on more vulnerable species. Those direct drivers of biodiversity loss are underpinned by what we call indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So they cause these drivers to happen. So here you can think of overconsumption, for example, inequality, poverty, among other indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So there are lots of different reasons why biodiversity is in decline. But fact is, we've lost an awful lot of our biodiversity already, and we are on track to lose even more. The fashion industry also has a big impact on biodiversity loss. And some research from Kering and PwC is showing us that especially in tier 4 of the supply chain, so that's where raw materials get produced, that's where the biggest impacts on biodiversity happen through greenhouse gas emissions, land use change, and water consumption. A textbook example of where the fashion industry has a negative impact on biodiversity is the Aral Sea. This is a sea that was located between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and used to be the 4th biggest lake on our planet. But over the years, the governments of these countries promoted a lot of cotton farming around this area, and a lot of that cotton obviously fed into the fashion supply chain. And the 2 main rivers that were feeding into this sea instead got diverted to irrigate the cotton crops. And over time, this lake became smaller and smaller. So we'll look at a bit of aerial footage from the Aral Sea from 1984 to 2016, and you can see how it's shrunk quite a lot. So here you can see that, since 1984, this area has completely changed, and a lot of this is now just a desert. So we have lost a lot of biodiversity already, and that brings risks to us as human beings in our day-to-day life and for our well-being, but also for businesses and the economy. PwC estimates that about half of the world's GDP is dependent on nature, either directly or indirectly. And this is also very much relevant for the fashion and design industries. Because when you think about it, a lot of the products that we end up selling in the fashion industry are dependent on nature in one way or the other. Maybe you're wearing a woolen jumper today. That wool comes from sheep, and those sheep depend on a healthy environment to live in. Or maybe you're wearing a cotton t-shirt. Well, that cotton needs water and needs healthy soils to grow. So a lot of the products that we end up selling in the fashion industries are dependent on nature one way or the other. And the loss of nature has a lot of impacts on businesses. So the first type of risks that it brings with it is physical risks. So if there's a lot of biodiversity loss and the loss of the ecosystem services that biodiversity provides, supply chains might be disrupted, or in worst case scenarios, you might lose all your raw materials completely. There's also litigation risk that comes with biodiversity risk. A lot of different countries and organizations are bringing in a lot of legislation to try and halt or revert even the loss of biodiversity. So, for example, the EU is bringing in a lot of legislation such as EUDR and CSRD. And as a business, you obviously have to comply to those incoming legislations. And if you don't, that can bring with it its own risks. The third type of risk that brings with it is transition risk. As the climate crisis is deepening, as people are becoming more and more aware of the biodiversity crisis, there's a bit of a shift in what consumers are expecting governments, organizations, but also businesses to do. So if you don't go with that change in feeling and perceptions, you might risk of turning customers and civil society against you. And the final category of risk that biodiversity loss brings with it from an economic point of view is systemic risk. We've all lived through a global pandemic not too long ago, and one of the leading hypotheses for why this global pandemic happened was because a virus jumped from wild animal to humans, and then we had the global pandemic. And as we destroy more and more natural habitat and we come into contact with wildlife more and more, there is definitely a risk that a global pandemic might happen again. And that obviously has huge impacts on the economy worldwide, as we've seen from COVID.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mirjam. We have a question from Rojira. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. She's asking if it's possible to share the link of the PwC report, which is being cited in the presentation.
Yeah, 100%. It's in the, so yeah, all the, if you can click here, then it's there. So I can definitely share that. That's no problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. The World Economic Forum is also expecting environmental issues to affect businesses, especially in the long term. When we look at the 10 years predictions, they think that at least 5 issues will have a massive impact on businesses, with biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse ranked 3rd there. So biodiversity is not doing great, and the loss of biodiversity brings with it a lot of risks for businesses. But there is some good news, and we can turn things around. So we'll leave the depressing things behind us now. We kind of look to the future. The first bit of good news is that nature conservation actually works. A big meta-analysis by Langhammer and team last year showed that 2/3 of conservation projects have a positive impact on biodiversity. And especially measures like introducing protected areas, the sustainable use of species, sustainable management of ecosystems, habitat loss reduction and restoration, and invasive and problematic species control can be very effective in halting the loss of biodiversity, and in some cases even improving biodiversity. So we know that we can turn things around. And the other bit of good news is that the level of funding that's going into conservation is increasing as well. So here you can see the level of funding from the GAF from 1991 all the way to next year, to 2026. And we can see obviously a real increase in investments in nature conservation. So that's great. But the thing is that if we increase our nature conservation efforts, we'll be able to halt the decline of biodiversity loss, but we won't really be able to turn things around. And that's what this figure is showing us. If we continue with business as usual, we'll keep losing biodiversity until we've basically nothing left. If we increase our conservation efforts through projects that WWF, Greenpeace, but also ZSL, among other NGOs do, we are successful in what we do, and we can halt the decline of biodiversity loss, but we can't reverse it. If we're serious about reversing trends, we'll have to have increased conservation efforts, but we also need to have sustainable production and more sustainable consumption. And this is where the corporate sector comes in. And this is where businesses, also in the fashion and the design industries, come in. Because the corporate sector is one of the most influential groups on Earth with the power and the resources to determine the future of our planet and the future of life on our planet. And I truly believe that businesses hold the key to reversing the change that we've seen in biodiversity. And this is basically the main reason that I work with businesses on biodiversity, because I really think that biodiversity can be reversed by businesses if we work together and if we do things well. There are also a lot of opportunities for businesses to work on biodiversity, a lot of positive reasons to engage with the topic, apart from just mitigating your risks. The first one is that it can help you enhance your reputation. As we looked at the transition risks in a few slides ago, if you go ahead of the curve and you increase your reputation in taking proactive actions around sustainability issues, including the climate and including biodiversity, it might really help you to draw in a certain type of customer. And some of these customers are also willing to pay more for healthy and more sustainable products. And especially when it comes to beauty and personal care products, things like products being natural, animal welfare being guaranteed, and packaging being sustainable are becoming more important for customers. You can also use biodiversity as part of your marketing if you dare to do that. Here you can see two different marketing campaigns from two different companies, a Spanish designer on the left-hand side and Everlane on the right-hand side, around biodiversity. The one on the left-hand side is all about overconsumption, and as we've seen, that's an indirect driver of biodiversity loss. And the one on the right-hand side is about plastic pollution and turning those plastic bottles into puffer jackets. And as we've seen, pollution is a major driver of biodiversity loss. And obviously, there are issues here around greenwashing that you have to be very careful of and very mindful of. But if you do it well, there's a real opportunity here to engage customers on topics of biodiversity and climate and nature. Just thinking beyond the kind of standard reasons of why you need to engage in biodiversity, there's a lot of space for innovation as well, especially when it comes to financing conservation projects. There are a lot of different avenues opening up now, and some of them you could see if you would be interested in as a business as well, to kind of diversify your income streams. So here you can think, for example, about biodiversity credits alongside carbon credits, even though there's a lot of work needed still to make those better than they are at the moment. But also other finance opportunities like species bonds or outcome bonds. There's a lot of happening in the nature conservation finance space that might be really interesting to engage with and might be an opportunity to diversify your income streams. And also, we should not forget that nature always has been a major source of inspiration for a lot of us. And if we keep nature and keep biodiversity in a good space, then that can also help us draw for future inspiration. And a lot of biodiversity also offers untapped potential for new products, also in the fashion and the design industries. And in the long term, a lot of the profitability depends on nature. Biodiversity ecosystems are so crucial for us to provide ecosystem services like pollination, water purification, and healthy soils. And a lot of our supply chains depend on that. So again, it comes back to those risks that I pointed out earlier to you, that to keep those risks in order and to not let them expand too much, the long-term profitability is really a big reason to engage with biodiversity. And biodiversity can also help you in having to not invest in very expensive measures. For example, mangroves can be really useful in reducing coastal erosion rather than having to build very expensive dikes and dams. I come from the Netherlands. I can tell you how expensive it is to maintain a lot of infrastructure. So where you can, kind of working with nature and seeing how you can use nature to prevent you having to build a lot more expensive systems can be very profitable. Similarly, in agriculture, rather than using chemical fertilizers, which can be quite expensive, or GMO seeds, for example, just making sure that you have healthy agricultural practices that maintain the soil can be a cost-saving measure. So there are a lot of reasons to engage with biodiversity, both to mitigate risks, but also there are a lot of opportunities. And I hope I give you an overview of that. But I think the person who can probably convince you even more is the poet Ashanti Kunene. She did a poetic provocation for the Systemic Investing Summit this year to summarize why biodiversity matters for business. So I'll just take a minute and listen to part of her poem. And I would encourage you to listen to the whole poem if you have a moment, because I think it's incredibly powerful. I'll play the video and I'll forward us a bit, so we just listen 2 minutes. If you can't hear the sound, don't stress, because there are subtitles here. And again, I hope you get to listen to the full poem perhaps a bit later today. So here we go.
So I've been asked to do a poetic provocation, and you will name me in this room. You will name me. She, Mother, Earth, womb, from whence you came, to which you will return. You will name me in this room. You will recall the reverence for life that we have forgotten. This is not a game. This is not a fire drill. You will remember. You must remember to name me. Heed this call and name me in the fine print of emerging, regenerative future economic possibilities. For I am not a bottom line, nor am I a footnote to be forgotten. I am not a DEI variable to be adjusted for. I am the mother of every market you have ever and will ever build. So name me in this room. And while you remember to say my name, unfrown your brow, unclench your jaw, unarmor your hearts, and unfist your hands. Because remember, my loves, there's no systemic impact without deep intimacy. There's no transformation without relational tenderness. And there's no future without her. She, Mother, Earth, womb from which we all come, to which we will all return. Name her, and may it all be well. Thank you.
So that's a poem that I think very neatly summarizes why biodiversity matters for businesses. So if you're keen now to start on your biodiversity journey, how can you start? Or if you've already started in your business, how can you proceed from where you're at? And that's what I would like to spend the last bit of this presentation on. I think if you are at the start of your biodiversity journey, I'd really encourage you that before you do any work, to spend a good amount of time convincing not just yourself, but also the other people around you in the business as to why we all should care about biodiversity and reverse biodiversity loss. I think that will make it a lot easier to get the support you need for any biodiversity projects later down the line. I've seen a lot of sustainability teams rushing into all sorts of biodiversity initiatives and assessments and things. And obviously there's a lot of work that needs to happen. But if you don't have the support from the business from the very start, it can be quite tough later down the line. And you might have to find that you'd have to do this work later, which is just a bit more difficult. And there are a lot of free resources out there that can really help you with explaining why biodiversity matters for businesses. If I can blow my own trumpet here, we at ZSL have developed Spot, which is a transparency toolkit. And as part of that, we have developed an entire training hub that explains why biodiversity matters for businesses, and it's all free to access. So you can follow the link and you can get access to this training hub and share it with colleagues and other people around the business if that would be helpful at all. I think it's really important that you do that and you have really clear as to what you want to do and why biodiversity matters for your business specifically. And then once you have support, there's a lot that you can do on biodiversity. A lot of people start on the left-hand side and work their way through to the right-hand side. So that's the way I'll talk through the biodiversity journey today as well. But it's not to say that you have to follow this pathway exactly. If anything, I would encourage you to try and end up on the right-hand side as soon as possible and try to implement any biodiversity projects very quickly, because obviously we've already lost a lot of biodiversity and we don't really have the luxury of sitting around and doing too much desk-based work for too long. We really need to get started on doing more for biodiversity within the corporate world. But if we start on the left-hand side, a lot of businesses start off with doing a biodiversity risk assessment. And there's a lot to say about measuring biodiversity within your business. The thing that makes it quite complicated is that there's no one biodiversity metric. Within climate, we've more or less agreed that tons of carbon is a good measure for carbon emissions. But within the biodiversity space, there is no one metric, and there will not be a metric anytime soon. And that can be confusing and it can make life a bit more difficult. I appreciate that. But I would also say that there are lots of different metrics out there already to measure biodiversity, and they all are relevant in one way or the other. I think your job is to try and select a measure that is most relevant for your specific case. Just take it, stick to it, and get on with actually trying to do a biodiversity impact project. Don't get too lost in how to exactly measure biodiversity, because it is complicated. It will be complicated. And again, there's lots of different ways you can do it. Just pick a few metrics, combine your basket, and please just move on to doing some work on biodiversity. In terms of actually doing a biodiversity risk assessment, it's important to know what you source and where you source it from, and then determine your impacts on biodiversity and also your dependencies on biodiversity to see how your business needs biodiversity to survive into the future. And again, please don't get too focused on measuring absolutely everything. There's a lot of resources and time that you can spend on the biodiversity risk assessment. Do one, but please then move on. And there are lots of tools out there that can help you with doing a biodiversity risk assessment, from mapping your supply chain to determining your impacts and your dependencies. And there's also a lot of paid help out there that you can access if you're keen to get support with that. So yeah, a lot of consultancies would provide support on doing biodiversity impact assessments. A lot of organizations move on to then develop their biodiversity strategy. And here you can see an overview of how you can get to your biodiversity strategy. If you've done your biodiversity risk assessment, you've done step 1 to 4 of this diagram. And then the next step would be to engage with step 5. So after you've done your risk assessment and you know your impacts and your dependencies on biodiversity, you can then explore your options to see what actions you might be able to take within or outside of your supply chain to improve biodiversity. And then it's super important to set targets that are clear and easy to measure, and to set out a monitoring strategy so you can see how you're doing on your targets, and also to see what's working and what's not working. And then you can draw it all together in your biodiversity strategy. And again, step 8 is what really matters. Try and move on to implementing your biodiversity strategy. Developing a biodiversity strategy is becoming more and more fashionable, I'm pleased to say. So some research by Textile Exchange shows that 59% of participating brands now have publicly committed to addressing their impact on biodiversity. But interestingly, only 8% of brands have a biodiversity strategy in place. And so there's a lot of work here to do to try and encourage more businesses to develop a biodiversity strategy, and ideally make that biodiversity strategy part of a bigger strategy on nature that also includes things like water, climate, etc. And again, there are lots of free tools out there to help you develop your biodiversity strategy. And again, a lot of services out there that would be very happy to help you with developing your biodiversity strategy. While you work on your strategy, I think it's super important to make sure that you communicate what you're doing with the people around you. Again, within the business, as I said at the start of this section, but also outside of the business. So think about engaging your investors, your buyers, your suppliers, your consumers, and other brands, including competitors, because we're all in it together when it comes to biodiversity. We all depend on the biodiversity around us on a day-to-day basis. And I think sharing lessons learned and sharing what you're doing can be incredibly powerful and incredibly important. And again, just a few examples of some brands that are doing that already. And then the final bit of the journey, which is the most important and the most interesting bit, is to actually start working on your biodiversity projects. And if you're thinking about implementing your strategy, I think it can be super helpful to keep the conservation mitigation hierarchy in your mind. And that's a framework that tries to encourage you to try and first think of actions that allow you to avoid any impact on biodiversity altogether. So an example here can be to develop a zero deforestation policy for your supply chain and to share that with your suppliers. So you avoid encouraging any more deforestation happening at all. There are cases where you can't avoid a biodiversity impact altogether. And in that case, the framework tries to encourage you to reduce your impact where you can. So if you think about the cotton supply chain, for example, after cotton is grown, it then needs to go through a wet processing stage. And you kind of need to do that to get your final cotton product. So we can't completely avoid the impact, but could we try and make the wet processing facilities as sustainable as possible, but trying to reduce the amount of water and the amount of chemicals that they use? That's an example of reducing your impact. If you can't avoid or reduce, you can then think about whether you could restore and regenerate. And an example of that could be to try and support the ecological restoration of deforested and degraded land, maybe even around some of your shops that you have. Or you could try and work with some of the farmers in your supply chain, for example, to try and see if they can farm more regeneratively. And while you do all that work on avoiding, reducing and restoring and regenerating, if you can, I think it would be super powerful if more brands engage with this transform part of the framework. And that encourages brands to try and work towards changing the underlying systems to address the drivers of biodiversity loss. So examples of work in that space can be for a brand to champion nature policies or to increase their supply chain transparency. Again, it can be a bit scary for a brand to do that, but I think it could be incredibly powerful if done well. And again, lots of free tools out there that can help you with seeing what actions you might be able to take as a brand, from the Science-Based Targets for Nature, the Mitigation and Conservation Hierarchy Initiative, and then also from Textile Exchange. So I'll close off with a few examples of brands that have been taking proactive action in the biodiversity space. And the first example is a company called Caring. And they've been working with Conservation International to set up the Regenerative Fund for Nature. So that's one example of a brand. And if you think about this framework that I just showed you, I think this very much fits into the regenerate part of the framework, where Caring with Conservation International is working with farmers to encourage them to farm more regeneratively. A second example of a brand that does a lot of work on biodiversity is Primark. Primark has a big training program for their cotton farmers, especially in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, among other countries. And what they've now done is they've set up a biodiversity monitoring program to look at how biodiversity is improving as a result of the training that they're delivering. So I actually had the pleasure to support Primark in setting up this biodiversity monitoring program. So this is me, if you didn't recognize me, working with Primark and a lot of local Indian ecologists to run biodiversity monitoring surveys in and around cotton farms, and looking at how biodiversity is improving as a result of the training that Primark is delivering. So another really great example of how a brand is engaging with biodiversity and using the data to then feed back into how they're delivering the training to their farmers. And I'll end the presentation today with a bit of a conservation optimism story. Because the good news is that since quite a few years now, there's been a lot of work done to try and restore part of the Aral Sea. And especially for the North Aral Sea, this has been quite successful because we've built a dam and that allowed a lot of the water to stay within inside the lake. And as a result of that, we've seen the return of almost 24 freshwater species and possible microclimate changes. So it really shows that we know what we need to do, and we also know that we can do it, and we can really reverse the loss of biodiversity if we work together. And again, I think businesses have a massive role to play here. So I think I'd really encourage you that as a business, especially in the fashion and the design industries, to engage with the topic of biodiversity and to see what you can do to make sure that we keep the planet as well as we can. So I'll leave you there. These are my details, as I said at the start. Feel free to reach out to me. Always very happy to chat. Yeah, and I'll close us off there. So thank you very much, and over to you, Federica.
Thank you, Mirjam. This was, for me, and I think for everyone, very insightful and interesting. Now, we already have some questions, actually, but if anyone else has a question, can write it in the chat box, as said before. But I'll start with the ones we already have. The first one is from Ruchira. Sorry for mispronouncing her name again. So what are tips you have for external consultants, policymakers, to encourage businesses to engage more in biodiversity conservation, sustainable consumption, and production? And she also asks, who do you believe are in the best, most pivotal positions to encourage and influence businesses in this direction?
Yeah, it's interesting. Those are interesting questions. Yeah, thank you for asking. I think different actors have different roles to play. I think obviously a lot of NGOs do an amazing role of raising awareness of businesses doing good and bad practices, and I think that's incredibly important. And I think also customers can play a massive role. So I think, yeah, lots of different actors can contribute. I'd say that within the business, I think quite often it's sustainability teams driving forward biodiversity programs. But I would really like to see collaboration across the business more, and getting the procurement team, the risk team, the communications team involved from the very start. I think some businesses have done that already, and I think that's incredibly powerful. If you get collaboration across the business together and all of these different teams buying into the idea that we need to work on biodiversity, I think that will lead to a lot more successful outcomes than if you just have the sustainability team trying to drive forward biodiversity programs within the business.
Thank you, Mirjam. We have one more question from Ludovica. She's asking, with so many tools and indicators, how should a brand choose which biodiversity metrics to use?
Yeah, that's the key question, and not an easy one to answer. I think this comes back to what I started off, that biodiversity journey that I presented with. I think the very first thing, before you even start thinking about what metrics you should choose, is why are you doing what you're doing? I think you really need to be super clear of the why, both for yourself, but also for the wider business, and again, for the different teams within the business. And I think then that will really help you to then choose what metric is most suitable in your specific case. There are lots of different metrics out there. I can't give you a clear example or kind of can say, oh, you should definitely always use this one or definitely always use that one, because there isn't one metric that's always suitable. I think it's about going on that journey and trying to choose the metric that is most appropriate for your specific case. And again, there's a lot of professional help out there that if you don't know, if you get a bit lost, which I would completely understand, there are lots of people who make it their full-time job to support you in choosing the right metric for the right scenario. Again, I think when it comes to biodiversity, there's not really a clear right or wrong answer. There's a lot of different ways in how you can measure it. I would just encourage you to choose a few metrics that you think are appropriate for reason X, Y, and Z, and then just to move on to implementing your biodiversity program. Have a strong monitoring program in place, see what's working, see what's not working, and then adapt. I've seen so many businesses getting quite stuck in this biodiversity risk assessment phase and just spending all their time and all their resources on that. And again, we don't really have the luxury to be doing that too much. So do your assessment, choose your metrics, do something that you think is about right. If you need help, get your help, and then please just move on to actually implementing your biodiversity programs, because that is what really counts. And every year, every month, every week really matters when it comes to biodiversity.
Thank you. We have a question from Tonya. She wants to know what she can do as a customer with their purchases in her everyday life.
Yeah, very good question, and thank you for asking. I think there are lots of different things that you can do as a customer. Probably the most powerful thing that you can do is try and reduce your consumption. So I think there was an initiative of like buying 5 garments a year at one point. Could be a nice challenge to try and take on, because I think overconsumptions, as I said in the webinar, is an indirect driver that drives a lot of these direct drivers that we've seen, like habitat loss, pollution, etc. So trying to reduce your consumption is a very good start. And then there are also things that you can do to try and address some of these direct drivers of biodiversity loss. So especially when it comes to clothes, microplastics are a big issue. So try and keep clothes for longer, because the longer you wash them, the less microplastics they release. Be mindful of the types of garments that you buy, because fleece, for example, is a lot more notorious for releasing a lot of microplastics than other types of materials. So try and kind of, increase your knowledge about these different things and see what you can do to try and reduce the impact that you have. And also buying from brands that are working actively on biodiversity, I think can be a very helpful thing to do. You can look out for things like the Better Cotton Initiative certification and other types of certification, which can help. Like, I won't say that certification is the end goal and if you buy a certified brand that everything is fine, but it definitely gives you an indication that a brand is actively working on sustainability and it is probably trying to improve things.
Thank you so much, Mirjam. That was very clear. Also for me as a consumer, it was really, really interesting. Roger asks again, a brand like Primark is notorious for sourcing cheap garments from sweatshops in South Asia. Given your experience, do you see a genuine desire in such businesses to change their entire models?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. And I think, I can't answer on behalf of Primark, but what I can say is I think a lot of businesses are actively thinking about how to change their models, because I think these risks are growing day on day, and especially when it comes to disrupting supply chains or materials not just being able to source at all, especially at the price that companies like Primark might need them to source at. I can see a genuine desire from a lot of businesses to try and change things, and it's been really encouraging to work in this space and to see so many different brands engaging with this conversation. But it's a difficult one, because I think for a lot of brands, the people in the procurement team have quarterly targets to reach, and they kind of need to reach them. Again, a lot of sustainability programs depend on how profitable the business is doing overall, and if the business is not doing well, these sustainability programs get cut. So it's difficult, and I think there are a lot of really great people working in this space, really trying to make a difference and trying their very best. And I think it is about kind of collaborating, trying to work together and see how we can change things step by step. And I really believe that if we do that all together, then we will see a revolution, and we will be able to live in a more sustainable world. So I think it's very good to ask these very critical questions, and then also to try and work together to see how we can address it and how we can build a better world together. But yeah, from my experience, I have seen an increase in the interest in sustainability, despite all the kind of political messiness that's been going on, especially in the last few months.
Thank you so much. As Sylvia says, it was very inspiring. Now also our Q&A session has come to an end, so thank you very much, Mirjam, again. And thank you all for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed our talk and find it relevant and interesting. As always, keep in mind that we'll be releasing 2 new podcast episodes in the coming weeks. In one, we will explore the importance of technology to monitor and regenerate biodiversity with 3B, which is a company, a nature tech company, using sensor-based systems to protect pollinators. And in the second episode, we will deep dive into regenerative design and more specifically into biomimicry with Biomimicry 3.8, which is a consultancy specializing in nature-inspired innovation. So look out for our next newsletters, because you find all the info or where and when to tune in there. Once again, thank you, Mirjam. Thank you very much to all of you for your time and participation. And we really look forward to seeing you in our future webinars. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Federica. Thanks all.
Thank you, Mirjam. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.